Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Just a quick note that this episode talks about the deaths of Indigenous children, and it may be distressing to some listeners. In the weeks since the Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc First Nation announced that they found the remains of 215 children at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, we've seen powerful tributes to the children from coast to coast, and the community itself has been in mourning. The news has also sparked a larger conversation around reconciliation and the need to look for burial sites all over the country where residential schools once stood, and statements from across the political spectrum on the need for immediate action.
We promised concrete action, and that's how we'll support survivors, families, and Indigenous peoples.
We're going to fight for justice for you.
Reconciliation does not mean anything if there is no action to accompany those words.
Today, I'm writing to the Prime Minister to ask him to take immediate action to address this unspeakable discovery and support the Indigenous communities and our country in mourning.
Tanya Talaga is a columnist for the Globe and Mail.
Bizu, my name is Tanya Talaga. I am a Anishinaabe journalist. I'm an author, a storyteller.
Tanya's been in Kamloops since Sunday, talking to people on the ground about what they're feeling and how to move forward. Today on The Decibel, an update from Kamloops, British Columbia. It's been about a week now since the Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc First Nation said that the remains of 215 children were found buried on the grounds of the former residential school in Kamloops, and you flew out there on Sunday. How have you spent the last few days?
As soon as I flew out on Sunday, I received a call from someone from the community, and she's like, just come out to the school. I just got off the plane, and then I had driven here from the airport, flew into Kelowna. And I just put my ribbon skirt on, grabbed my bundle, and I went out to the school. People that are from here have been affected. They are coming. The people of Kamloops have been going as well. There's been laying down of teddy bears and flowers and little pairs of shoes. In the soccer field, actually, there are 215 solar lights that have been placed on the hill of the soccer field, and a little pair of shoes or a little teddy bear is placed at each one of the solar lights.
Mm-hmm. I've been reading about similar tributes, I guess, across the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been incredible to see the outpouring of affection and grief and loss. 2 nights ago, I was at the school again, and I was just sitting on the soccer field, and the soccer field's right in front of the school, the front doors of the school. And all of a sudden I heard like a drumming sound on the right-hand side of me. There was about 40 members of a First Nation that were drumming in, and their young men were carrying this long, thin canoe on their shoulders. And everyone gathered along the top of the soccer field, and we all stood there and watched this incredible ceremony. And they were from the Stolo Nation, Chilliwack, and they had come to take their children home. They had 9 kids that never came home that went to the school.
Wow. And
they were there with their canoe to take their spirits home. Mm-hmm. And so they drummed and sang and danced, and it was absolutely breathtaking. You know, those are the scenes that are happening here. Those are the ceremonies that are happening here, because so many nations have been affected in this territory. And it's all so raw, right? Everyone remembers, and everyone has family that's been affected. You know, it's a heavy feeling of sorrow, of grief, of strength, though, and of love and resiliency, and of knowing. You know, Indigenous people have been saying for such a long time, the survivors have been saying for such a long time, our playmates disappeared, our brothers disappeared, our sisters disappeared, our friends disappeared. And for so long, they weren't believed. Their stories were brushed away.
That's something that I've heard over and over again as I've been watching the coverage of this. You wrote about the volume of the Truth and Reconciliation report called Missing Children and Unmarked Burials, which pointed out that the Canadian government had never answered the questions of who died and why they died and where they're buried. The federal government has now committed $27 million to Indigenous communities that want to search for potential burial sites. If this was something that was so widely suspected, there's so many stories about it, why do you think it took this horrific discovery to bring the issue of these missing and dead children to the forefront?
Canada's had a history of looking away, of not paying very much attention to the true history of this country. And it's only been recently, too, that people have been waking up to it and accepting it. I think that we're at a time in Canadian history now where people's ears and eyes and hearts are opened. I think social media, I think Idle No More has helped push that forward. I think the TRC has helped push that understanding forward. Generations of Canadians were raised. If you were raised going to public school or Catholic school here in Canada, you were not taught about the residential school system. You were not taught about the Indian Act. So we've had entire generations of lawmakers, teachers, dentists, doctors, nurses, editors, journalists that don't know anything about the true history of this country. Why is that? It was left out of the school system. Right? That's why education reform is so important. That's why all the curriculums across Canada need to be changed to reflect the true history of this country. And those changes cannot be a choice.
How would you change the curriculum? What do you think should be included in it that isn't right now?
First Nation, Métis, Inuit, teachers, elders, knowledge keepers, they all came together several years ago. I think it was right at the end of when Premier Ford, he was just coming into power. Everyone had been working on the changes of the curriculum. And this was done at the behest of the provincial government under Premier Kathleen Wynne. And then all of those changes were not implemented. Those meetings were canceled right off the bat. It's all on public record. These were all news stories at the time. And that work needs to be revisited. All the boards are making sure they have Indigenous educators. They're making sure, for instance, grade 11 English is turning towards examining Indigenous literature. Little changes like that. Can we not look at some Indigenous literature and place 1 year where you're just looking at Indigenous authors, people from this land who have been in this land for thousands and thousands of years? And I know that a lot of boards are working towards doing that. And a lot of teachers are taking up that mantle because here's the thing, we can't wait for governments to make policy changes. We can't wait for institutions to suddenly wake up one day and decide they want to change and make things better and right. We have to do it for ourselves. It has to be the will of the people moving forward.
And based on all of your reporting and the conversations you've had and even your personal experience, do you think these gaps in the curriculum, do you think that's kind of at the heart of the ignorance around Indigenous issues in Canada?
That's part of it. Racism is the other big part of it. And where does racism come from, though? It comes from a lack of knowledge. It comes from a lack of education, a lack of understanding.
Just going back to the finding of the remains of these children, what kind of work is being done now to identify them?
The community is handling all of the remains of the children. That's in their purview right now. They were the ones that started this process in the first place because of the knowing, of the survivors saying for such a long time, there are people here, our children are here. And so they got the funds together and they started looking. I do know that the BC Coroner's Office has been here and they are also taking a lead in trying to figure out what steps to do next. Communities will decide what to do with their lost children and how to take the next steps forward. There are protocols and ceremonies associated with the different nations, and each of them will make their own decisions. That's definitely up to the community to decide what happens next.
So the number of deaths of children in residential schools officially recorded by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is 3,200. But as you noted in your piece, former Senator Murray Sinclair, who is also the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he said it could be as high as 15,000. How does he explain how that number could be so high?
Well, it's all in the TRC report itself. And in the report, it talks about the fact that a certain amount of schools that were sanctioned, I think at the beginning it was 134 and then it rose to 139. But the survivors of 1,300 schools have been asking to have their schools added to the commission. And that has been denied time and time again. They were privately run, other religious denominations, and the provinces. So sort of a wide range of people that ran these schools. But if you look at how many children are lost at every school, and then you look at 1,300, I think you could probably come to the number of 15,000. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility. A question is, why didn't the churches keep records of who died? If they did, are they in some sort of vault somewhere that they're not sharing? I actually don't think they kept a record. And that's something that the Catholic bishops should be answering to. But all schools, you hear from survivors, you hear very similar things. People were not properly fed. Malnutrition was something that many people felt at the school, experienced at the schools. Clothing, not being clothed properly. Clearly abuse. Can't speak your language, your hair is cut, you have long braids as soon as you come here. Loneliness, despair, that neglect, and what that does to a child, and not really knowing where your parents are anymore. What happened to your parents? Those feelings of loss and abandonment and pain for your parents, your siblings, because you can't, like many of the schools, you couldn't see your siblings, you couldn't see your friends, they'd separate you. It's just such a feeling of dislocation and loss.
I know you personally were invited to Kamloops by the chief of the Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc First Nation, and you're one of the few reporters to be invited by the chief, from what I understand. And you've reported extensively on the deaths of Indigenous children. With Seven Fallen Feathers, you wrote about the children who died in Thunder Bay. You've covered youth suicide in Indigenous communities. What did this discovery mean to you on a personal level?
I was really honored to get just sort of a tap from someone who is here with the community, who's a community member. And she reached out to myself and a couple of other Indigenous, actually female journalists, and said, will you tell the story? And I have to say, at this time, I am grateful to be here, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. Being here is, I'm here as part of my family. I represent my family here. I represent those that we've lost, and I feel them very much when I'm here. As well, too, this is still happening, right? Like, this is not a dark chapter in Canada's history. I mean, you mentioned Seven Fallen Feathers, you mentioned All Our Relations. I have written 2 books on genocide in this country. I've written 2 books on racism in this country. We have, any day now, a report will be coming out in Thunder Bay looking at 9 deaths of Indigenous people that had to be re-examined because the Thunder Bay police force didn't do a proper job in investigating them in the first place. And that is seen all over the country. I mean, like, where have the police authorities been with all of these survivor tales of the lost children? How come every single residential school site across this country is not now treated as a crime scene? And again, we still have children that are dying in the waters in Thunder Bay, are dying in the city, that come for high school because they don't have high schools for them in their home communities. So they come into Thunder Bay.
For a kid to leave home is wrong, but that's just the reality of our situation. Because I don't see the federal government pouring more money into our communities.
And those 9 deaths I was talking about, 4 of them are of the Seven Fallen Feathers. So this is not something that was in the past.
How does the community feel about the media right now and about how the story is being covered?
Well, the community put out a press release that asks the media not to come here, to give the community time to conduct ceremony, time to process the discovery of what's happened here, and time to breathe. And as well, too, the community is well aware that this has touched off a wider story, a wider awakening of the need to look at all the schools across the country. There is a responsibility by the community with all the other things that they're dealing with to, they realize that too, that this is now part of their reality and that they're leading the way on what to do next and how to move forward.
I've read that the chief of the Tk'emlúps Secwépemc First Nation, I've read her comments on why the band has chosen not to tear down the building that housed the school. So she said in an interview with APTN, we're not going to wipe away that history. We're not going to forget that history. And at the same time, we're hearing calls across the country for statues and monuments to people who were the architects of the residential school system, like Sir John A. Macdonald, to be taken down, calls for institutions like Ryerson University, which is named after Egerton Ryerson, to be renamed. I wonder if you can talk a bit about the importance of symbols. What would it mean to Indigenous people to see these statues taken down, to see these names changed?
When it comes to names and statues, they are symbols of the colonial past, right? They make you feel uneasy. I mean, I get uneasy when I'm driving down the 401 and look at the Sir John A. Macdonald Highway, in Kingston, and all the Sir John A. Macdonald paraphernalia that's all throughout Kingston. It sort of gives me the willies, the same with the Ryerson statue. The name Ryerson, I mean, that's all part of the narrative of this country, that these are our forefathers that built this incredible land, but they murdered our children with their policies. That's Canada's way, is, to use policy and administration to create things like the Indian Act, to create things like the reserve system, to not honor any one of the treaties that built this country, to operate under a system of oppression, to assimilate our children, to make them good British subjects, and all of that was left behind. And then spinning this narrative of this is the good, humane, grand Canada, with a universal healthcare system and a universal education system that's so great for everybody. Meanwhile, our kids don't have high schools in a lot of communities, and meanwhile, our communities don't have clean drinking water and working sewage infrastructure. There's the myth of Canada and there's the reality of Canada. And these things, these symbols represent those, right? Like they represent the myth, not the reality.
How does a community heal from something like this? What are the conversations you're hearing around how to move forward?
Documenting the whereabouts of all of the lost children is needed. And all the survivors, everyone who needs, intergenerational survivors too, everyone who needs help dealing with this, that needs to happen too. Because one of the things that ended was the supports for survivors. And those supports need to be brought back so the survivors can get all the support that they actually need right now. Mm-hmm. Psychological support, emotional and mental support for having all of this happen again.
Carolyn Bennett, the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, she compared this moment to the death of George Floyd in the U.S., which sparked a national reckoning on racism there and to some extent here. Do you see it similarly? Is this a watershed moment? You mentioned that the community understands that they have become part of a larger conversation. And right now, this is top of mind for so many people. But as you've written about, we've seen people turn away from this kind of news before. Mm-hmm.
I believe this is a watershed moment. This is definitely one of those moments in Canada's history. I mean, when you see all of the little shoes, all over the country in cities and communities, when you see the light warriors, flashing up these beautiful images of, 215 and Every Child Matters on buildings, like it is something different. And what is different too is it has actually sparked a commitment from Canada to search every single one of the schools, right? And so that is huge. That has not happened before. So if nothing else, there's that. That is an absolute integral thing that's happened. We have to bring our kids home, and that's the first step.
Tanya, thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Miigwech.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Tanya Talaga. You can find her on Twitter at Tanya Talaga. The number for the National Indian Residential School crisis line is 1-866-925-4419. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you on Monday.